Welcome to the Living Ageless and Bold podcast. Each episode, I bring you amazing women who inspire, educate, and share their experiences and journeys along the way. So grab a glass of wine or a cup of coffee, find a cozy spot, and let's relax and have some fun hearing what can be accomplished after 55. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of Living Ageless and Bold. Today's story is just truly incredible. At 27, Linda Broenniman uncovered a huge family secret. She grew up one of 7 kids, which she thought was a typical Catholic household. Her family had come over from Hungary in 1949, after the war, starting this new, fresh life. And she discovered many years later that they were in fact not Catholic, that her father was Jewish. So she spent many years searching for the truth. She wrote a book called the Politzer Saga, which is an epic story spanning 300 years of Hungarian Jewish experiences, her personal memoir, her family history, and life history, world history. So it's really incredible, and it allowed her to honor the memories of all of those lost in her family. So we're going to have a really cool conversation today. Welcome, Linda.
Well, thank you, Christina. That's such a beautiful introduction. Thank you. And thank you for having me on your show.
Well, when somebody reached out, I don't know if it was your publicist, somebody, but this story is so close to my heart. My grandmother was a Ukrainian Jew who fled during the Bolshevik Revolution to Berlin and married my grandfather, who was not Jewish, but all of his siblings were. And they were all, were Nazis. My grandfather was not Jewish. My grandmother was. His siblings were all Nazis. Wow. So I grew up with a history that is just unbelievable. And reading your stuff and I've written it down and I've told my kids, but I really need to go deeper. So thank you for coming on and thank you for sharing your story. And you grew up in Buffalo, New York, just a good Catholic family with 7 kids.
Exactly.
Right?
And as you said, I grew up these 7 kids, a chaotic household, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
But, I just thought we were a normal family, but I didn't have grandfathers. And my grandmothers actually did end up living with us. They came in 1956 after the Hungarian Revolution. But, they just, they never talked about history. So it's like I didn't have a history. And it was just something that was, I accepted when I was really young. But as I grew older, things sort of started to change. And as you said, when I was 27, I was in graduate school and I came home for vacation and my brother sort of said, guess what? My father's Jewish. And we found out all by accident. So, and that's an interesting story. So my sister, who's a doctor, went to a medical meeting in Montreal and stayed with her godmother. And her godmother had been, they'd been family friends in Hungary and they went back generations of very close friends. And so my sister sort of asked her what she thought was an innocent question. She said, what was our great grandmother Margit like? And the answer came back and she said, oh, like most Jewish women, she was kind and gentle, but she ruled the roost. So I think my sister sort of, must have done a double take. Like, what do you mean Jewish? And her godmother said, whoops, I thought you knew. So that was how we found out, by sheer accident.
And it's fascinating because now with all of the genetic testing, the I always say it wrong, 1, 2, 3, you and me, whatever that is. So many people are uncovering things like this. I was just with a girlfriend this past weekend. They found their long lost sister from the same parents, but they weren't married yet.
Wow.
And I have another friend, very similar story. They got the thing back and she said, Jewish, I'm not Jewish. And come to find out, when grandpa was at war, grandma was with the next door neighbor.
Oh
And
my.
yeah, and oops, she was in her 90s and was on her deathbed. So they never told her they knew,
Wow.
but to have your sister, hear it like that is
Yes.
because how old was she at that point?
She must have been 33.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then she says, "Oh, I'm going to go home," and she came
So
home and told all of you. And
well, she told my older brother, and then my older brother told me, and I immediately went to my mother and I said, "Is this true?" And my mother said it was true, but my father, to his dying day, would not admit that he was Jewish and would not talk about any of it. So,
well, it was and for people who don't know, a lot of history that we lived because it was our families, people who were born here, raised here generation after generation, they don't understand what that was, what that time was. And my grandmother did not talk about it either for a very, very long time.
yeah.
So talk a little bit about that and why, because I totally understand it, but a lot of people watching and listening aren't going to understand it.
Well, I think they suffered such trauma. And when you think about it, I mean, they were targeted simply because they were born in a certain religion, and we're all people. We're all sort of the same, but to be targeted that way is so traumatic, and they lived through such traumatic times. My father was conscripted into a Nazi labor camp, and he escaped from that when the camp was bombed. Almost everybody in the camp died, except for these 6 men who escaped. And then after they escaped, they were caught twice more and escaped again. And there's just trauma after trauma. And my mother, even though she was Catholic, she hid Jews. So for which later on we didn't know anything about it. And she was honored as righteous among the nations by the Israeli government. And for your listeners who don't know, that is the highest honor that the Israeli government gave non-Jews who risked their lives and saved Jews during the war. And for example, Oscar Schindler, and most people know Oscar Schindler. He's probably the most famous. But when you think about it, throughout the world, there's only 20,000 people, less than 20,000 people who have been given that honor. And when you think about the 6 million who died, that's such a small number. So to risk your life during that time was something amazing. So yeah. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, no, it truly was. And I remember stories where my grandfather was not Jewish, so he was fine, but my grandmother, and obviously then her children were my dad and my aunt,
right.
And they would hide them in bomb shelters in the bottom of the apartment buildings, so they couldn't find them and take them away.
Exactly.
And that's what people did. And my listeners have heard this story before, but my father was born in a bathtub in the basement of the hospital because they wouldn't let a Jewish woman in.
Wow.
And the nurse who helped her till she died was my Aunt Ruth. Ruth.
Oh my goodness.
Because she was the woman who, took my grandmother and helped her have the baby.
Wow.
But it was just such a different time that unless you have these family stories, you don't understand, what the families went through. And I understand why your father, because you never know, is another Holocaust going to happen? You don't think so.
Exactly. And when you look at what's happening today, it's scary, right? It's, there's so much hate and fear being perpetrated right now. And so, and my parents understood what that could lead to. And it was traumatic, and they lost everything they had. My father was actually, and one of the things that was interesting during this journey of researching my family, I, learned so much about them. And, miraculously, we were able to go back 8 generations, 300 years, as you said. But it turns out my father was actually from a very prominent Jewish family, filled with lawyers and doctors. And for him to not talk about that, because both my father and my grandmother, they were big storytellers. They loved to, talk about things and so on and so forth. But for him never to talk about his family must have been really hard for him, very.
Did your mother ever tell you things that she knew, even though your father would never corroborate it?
That's such a good question, because my mother really didn't. And I'll qualify that a little bit, but I think it really goes to their incredible love story, because she never really revealed that my father was Jewish, even though, she told me when we thought we knew, and she thought it was important that she tell the truth, but she always protected him. And part of that protection was her not talking about her incredibly heroic deeds. So it had to be hard for her too. Now, there's a couple things. When I did travel to Budapest with my parents a couple times, but the second time in 1990, by that time I had just found out that I was Jewish. And actually it was great because my father was busy doing some consulting work. And my mother and I got to spend a lot of time together, just one-on-one, and I peppered her with questions. And so she told me little things, but, and little pieces, but two things. One, I didn't have the history at the time to really ask the right kinds of questions. And then secondly, she only told me sort of half truths. She was still just protecting my father.
So how were you able to go back 8 generations? Because again, my grandmother, the same thing. She fled from Russia. She never saw her mother again. She was a teenager. It's just so tragic, but they sewed some jewelry and money in her coat, and she left with friends, and that was it. Yeah. So I know a little bit from what my aunt remembers from, my great grandparents' generation, but that's about it, because I keep saying, I'm actually getting my German citizenship. Come to find out, I actually am a German citizen. I was born before my father became a U.S. citizen. So in digging through this, they wanted all this information from my grandmother. And I said, well, she's Ukrainian, and I don't think I'm getting anything from Ukraine right now. We're going to have to go with plan B. Yeah. So I'm curious, how are you able to go back 8 generations?
So, and let me back up a little bit before. So what happened was, I decided that I really wanted to look into my family's history, but I didn't really know where to start at all. And then, in 2011, my parents' house caught fire, and my sister, in all the chaos, she was pulling things out and trying to save them. Those that had survived the fire, there was the water damage from the fire trucks. So she was trying to pull things out, and she didn't even realize it. She pulled out a box, and then that box ended up getting put in the back of one of her closets in her home. So in about 2016, as I said, it was time. I realized it was time. I really wanted to look into my family's history. I wanted to learn about Margit, my great-great-grandmother Margit. And I really didn't have anything to go on except the name Adam Politzer. And I didn't even know what the name Politzer, I didn't know any of the family names. But
how did you learn that name? Where did that come from?
Yeah, I had remembered that when my brother came home from medical school and told my parents he was going to go into ear, nose, and throat. And my mother said, "Oh, you have a very famous relative, Adam Politzer, who was in ear, nose, and throat." But I never knew. I just happened to remember that name, but I had no idea how we were related, who he was, whatever. Well, I started to do a Wikipedia search, just search online. And he, to this day, he is considered the father of otology, which is the study of the ear. So most ear, nose, and throat surgeons will know his name. And so he's got a Wikipedia page. He's got all, if I knew German, I could have read his textbooks and articles. He had lots of stuff on the internet. But I had no idea how we were related. So I was really frustrated and trying to understand. And then my sister discovers the box in her closet and sends it to me. And there's all of these papers, papers, letters, even photographs, and so on. But most of it is in Hungarian. And so I'm sitting there in Google Translate, Microsoft Translate, and they don't work. Hungarian's a really, really tough language, and
it's probably handwritten.
Yes.
Right? Back then it wasn't typed. I know a lot of the old things that I have.
Yeah.
And that European handwriting is not what we're used to. And that's not going to be easy. Yeah.
Not at all. So I'm trying to figure things out, and I just couldn't do it. So then I started looking for somebody who could help me. And it took a while, but through a friend of a friend, I found this lovely, lovely lady who lives in Rockville, Maryland. It's about, half an hour from here. And I took one of the folders in the box. And I took it, I remember it was in May, like on a beautiful Saturday morning, and one of the first days of spring that was warm and beautiful. And I thought, I'll just be there for an hour. And I think I was there for like 6 hours and finally had to leave because I had another commitment. But I learned so much from her. And she said, some of these documents are really belong in a museum, but you really need to have them researched. So she put me in touch with this remarkable man, András Gazitsky, who lived in Hungary and who was just brilliant. He was a lawyer and a sociologist, and a remarkable person and an incredible sleuth. So I started working with him. And as it turned out, in the box, and what I started doing is I started scanning all of the documents and the letters and so on, and then sending them to him and so on. But it turns out that one of the letters in the box was from my father's cousin's niece, and she had saved a book that was written by Sigmund Politzer, who was Adam's youngest brother. They were from a family of 14, if you can believe it. And Sigmund was the second youngest. And he had written a book called Our Family History. And he went back. Now, he lived in the late 1800s. He died in, I think, 1920. So he had gone back generations. And with that book, we were able to use that sort of as the basis of many of the things we found. But, András was remarkable. He would learn something, and then he would explore and explore and explore. And he always had to verify. So he would always make sure that whoever we were researching, it was the right person from the right family, and the information was correct. So he was just a remarkable partner in the journey. He was wonderful.
So he put together your family history. What was it that sparked you to write your book, to really put it all together?
Well, there's a couple things. So one, as he would find things, first of all, as I said, my history was not good enough. So I needed to delve in, and I read so many history books and biographies that were of the era that we were researching, whatever I could get my hands on. And, we truly were partners, because I would find something and then I would ask him about this, and he goes, oh, I didn't think about that, so let me research that. So it was a great partnership. But one was really understanding the context of the times. So as I would find out about the person and then research the history around when they lived, I needed to organize it in my brain. And the best way to organize it was to just start writing and to write the stories, because I realized as I wrote the stories, I'd have to delve even deeper and try to understand, why they did something. So, so it was just my way of really connecting with them. And then it became the book. So I think the other thing that sort of prompted me to turn it into a book was that at the same time as we were doing this research, there's a beautiful synagogue in Budapest called the Rumbach Synagogue that had never been renovated since World War II. And so the Hungarians raised quite a bit of money for its restoration. And they wanted to put a permanent exhibit in the synagogue to actually encourage others to look into their own history. So they asked if they could use our story as the basis for the exhibit. So we now have, a permanent exhibit in the Rumbach Synagogue that includes films that are solely based on the stories in the book. And so as this was going on, I realized also that the exhibit consists of 10, they're 7-minute films. And I thought, the films aren't enough to truly connect to these people. So I really wanted their fuller stories told. So, yeah.
Sounds like you need to take this to Steven Spielberg.
I'd love to.
Yeah.
I would love that.
Yeah. I mean, it is these historic journeys. I had another guest on last year, Eva Nguyen, and she was on the last, or is believed to be the last flight out of Saigon.
Oh my God.
And her father basically found an old plane and got it to be able to fly. And they were all crammed in there with no door. And then he ended up dying. They didn't even know till they got to Guam. He got a van out of the way so the plane could take off and somebody else flew the plane.
Oh my God.
So it's just this kind of like this, like you can just see this as a movie.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me, with everything you uncovered, 8 generations, what was your favorite story about your family?
That I don't really know how to answer that question, because as I connected to each and every relative, I just, I felt like I really wanted to know them. For example, Sigmund, who wrote the our family history, he just sounded like this remarkable person. And he was the second youngest of 14. His father, Abraham, was this amazing figure who had come from sheer poverty because his father had been murdered by the Napoleon soldiers. So he grew up in incredible poverty, but then ended up, building an incredible life, had built, a lot of, I don't know if they were wealthy, but he was a generous benefactor. So he gained a lot of wealth. And, but he was considered just like the father of the entire town. Everyone went to him and so on. So Sigmund writes about him with such love and such admiration. But then Sigmund was only, I think, like 10 or 12 when he died of appendicitis, but nobody knew what appendicitis was back then. So he died of appendicitis. And here Sigmund is this young kid who really struggles in school because I think he's missing his father. His older brothers try to take him in and give him these jobs, but they really use him more as slave labor. So he struggles and struggles, but then he becomes successful. And the way he talks about his success, he's so humble and so, he's got so much humility, but so much love. And here he became incredibly successful himself. He was a big investor in automobiles and
I was just going to ask you.
Automobiles and the railroad and things like that. He gave this remarkable speech I want to say the New York Stock Exchange. It was the Budapest Stock Exchange. And talk about, being so relevant. He advocated for more transparency, which is what we need in our day and age. These problems are the same as what they had back then. So he was this remarkable person. And, and so he was one, but then, there's so many more. My great-great-grandfather was he was a lawyer. He was a founder of the Budapest Bar, but he grew up in extreme poverty because his parents, he was orphaned during the cholera epidemic of, I think it was 1876 or something. He becomes this very prominent lawyer, and Andras found all of these speeches that he had written and articles about him because in 1934, they were honoring the oldest members of the Budapest Bar, and he was at that time the third oldest. So there were a lot of articles, and again, just this person who believed in truth and justice and family was so important to him. And then he died in the Holocaust at age 99, and he died of starvation in the hospital in the ghetto. So you think of these people who have gone through just tremendous cataclysmic events and have always come out as people who cared. They were so generous and caring and believed in serving humanity.
It's amazing that you say that, because I talk about my grandmother a lot about that. So my grandfather had 5 siblings that were all Nazis that all wanted her dead. Wow. And she literally forgave them all.
Yeah.
And that's this life lesson that, as I got older and heard the stories and really, really understood what happened in World War II, and to think, gosh, that woman, everything she went through, and she forgave them all.
That's
every
amazing.
Last one of them.
That's amazing.
But your family too, they live that, and that they have this gift of compassion and kindness and forgiveness. And it's just truly incredible. I mean, really.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and then, Margie, so back to the person that we really, this whole thing started about.
We just wanted to know about Margie.
Yeah, exactly.
We got 8 generations.
Exactly. And she was this remarkable person also. So she grew up, her father was Ignaz Misner, the big lawyer that I just spoke about. So she grew up in privilege and, with a lot of wealth. And, but was the kindest, most generous person. But then she becomes a nurse during World War I. And at that time, somebody in her station, did not need to work. So she did it all out of compassion and trying to help. And there were a lot of family members who served in World War I. But then after World War I, there was in Hungary, there were 2 revolutions, the Red Terror and the White Terror. And the White Terror was really targeted communists. The Red Terror was perpetrated by communists, trying to get a communist government. But then the White Terror, they targeted communists, but they targeted Jews. And one of the torture chambers that was set up was in the basement of the hotel that was right next to their home. So you can imagine the fear that created. And then her husband died, and we don't really know exactly how he died. And I sort of have this inkling that maybe he had been a target of the torture. I don't know. I think her brother was, though it was never talked about. But then there comes a period of peace, and then World War II happens, and World War II, the Germans didn't come into Hungary until late in the war, until 1944. But there were so many leading up to that, there were still so many anti-Semitic laws that were being perpetrated, and slowly and surely all of their their wealth was gone. They had to, in 1938, they had to give up their farm. They had a farm outside of Budapest that was about 10,000 acre estate that they had to give up. And, they had to give up her father's housekeeper of 27 years had to be dismissed because they weren't allowed to hire Christians. And, then they took their jewelry, they took all their valuables. So, slowly and surely, all of these laws and their whole life becomes so, so constricted. And then they lose their home. So in June of 1944, they had 5 days to pack up this huge house and move into one room in a Yellow Star house in Budapest. And so, and you think about, so she sort of took charge of all of that for her husband's, for her family, for probably my grandmother's family, her father, Ignaz Misner, her brother, who was single. They all lived in this humongous apartment house, but it was all apartments that were inhabited by family members. So she had to, pack up all these households and have 5 days to move into one room in a Yellow Star house. But then it didn't end for her. Then she, all the hiding throughout the war and so on. And after the war, there were 2 years in which Hungarians were trying to put together, rebuild their lives. They were trying to establish a democratic government. But the communists started, slowly and surely putting the screws on. And then when the communists take power, she again loses her home. She's expelled to a farm. And by this time, she's 76 years old. And she's expelled. She and my grandmother were expelled to a farm because they were, quote, bourgeois. Then finally, and she's given these small documents of paper that say, you've lost we've taken over your home in Pest. They had a lovely villa in Buda in the hills that were taken. And then, of course, the farm had already been taken. So she loses everything. And finally, after Stalin died, then she was allowed to come back and she could rent 2 rooms in her home, in her own home. So it was, she lived a very difficult life going through all these incredible events, but she never seemed to lose her spirit. She was always generous and loving. And, I remember, I was only 6 when she died, but I remember her always sending, birthday cards and things like that. And she was just, this amazing, I call her an indomitable spirit. She's beautiful. So
what a treasure that you have. And for everybody listening and watching, this is your cue to do some research in your family while you can. Yes. It's much easier when people are alive. And, we have recordings now. You can record on phones. And because this, like I said, we only go back to my great grandparents' generation. But the stories that you have that will now through your book share generation to generations to come, that's just so exciting. And like I said, just a treasure and a gift for your family.
Yes. Yeah.
So, Linda, I want to ask you, if you had one piece of advice to give yourself, your 30 or 40-year-old self, what would that be?
Oh, instead of giving in to this, what I thought was this impenetrable wall of, web of secrets, I would have, just asked and asked and asked, because I think about my grandmother who lived with us. She would have known Adam Politzer and Sigmund Politzer, only as a teenager, but she still would have known them. And of course, Ignaz Misner was her grandfather. So to be able to learn those personal stories from her would have been incredible. And she loved to tell stories. So she's another one who got, was not allowed to say anything. But I wish I had pushed. But, I also know that I did ask her once about her husband, and I think and he had died. He was taken and died in Dachau. And I think what happened is, such sadness came over her face that as a young child, I just didn't want to make her more sad. So it's, it's a hard balance, but I wish I had pushed. I wish I had pushed and learned more of those stories from people who were alive.
At least you were able to find what you did. And we'll have all the information about your book and your website and everything in the show notes, so people can look at it and share the story. We all have a history.
Yeah.
So share the episode, let people get excited. You have me excited now to call my aunt's 89. I'm like, I really need to I talk to her regularly, but it's like, is there anything I don't know? Is there anything I'm missing?
Yeah.
So, Linda, thank you so much for joining me today. This was really great.
Oh, Christina, thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation. So appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for listening or for watching this episode of Living Ageless and Bold. If you haven't already, please make sure you hit subscribe. And if you like the episode, I hope that you will give us a great review. You can also head over to livingagelessandbold.com and sign up for information, inspiration, and exclusive opportunities for us, women over 55. Thanks for listening. And remember, no matter what you do, keep living ageless and bold.